The road to the Civil War can really be seen as starting with the beginning of another war, the Mexican-American War, which was started by President James K. Polk. When Polk was running for office in 1844 as a Democrat, he said that he wanted three areas. He wanted Texas, he wanted Oregon, and he wanted California. Now, John Tyler gave him Texas basically as he was walking out of office, so Texas was annexed as part of the United States. He didn't end up going to war with Britain over Oregon. He agreed on a compromise at the 49th parallel. But California was still out there. And he tried to buy California, but Mexico was upset that essentially Texas had been stolen from them, so they refused to negotiate. So Polk sent Zachary Taylor and a bunch of troops right down to the border of Mexico, in between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Yes, many people actually do pronounce it Rio Grande as opposed to Rio Grande. Now, in this disputed area where Mexico claimed that their border was a Nueces and the United States claimed that it was a Rio Grande, these troops sat, and they sat, and they sat, and they were hoping to get shot at so they could have a pretense for starting war. And just as it looked like the U.S. troops would never get shot at, they finally got shot at. And so that there was, in fact, quote-unquote, legitimate reason for war. Now, this, of course, did not stop people like Abraham Lincoln, a Whig congressman from Illinois in the House, from saying, "Show me the spot." Because if, in fact, that was Mexican land, there was no reason to start a war over it. So those were known as the spot resolutions. There were Northern Whigs, conscience Whigs, like Lincoln in Congress, who said this is a completely illegitimate war fought to create a slaveocracy, that this is nothing more than a land grab to try to get more cotton-growing land in the South and the Southwest. In fact, people like Henry David Thoreau, the transcendentalist writer in the Northeast, refused to pay his poll tax and wrote civil disobedience about it because he said, when the government is doing something that you don't agree with, you need to be able to protest. Now, in the war itself, the United States ends up winning over the course of 2 years. It's not necessarily an easy war, despite the fact that the Mexicans are not terribly strong as a military, but the United States does ultimately win and signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with the Mexican government. Now, during the war itself, in 1846, and then in 1847, then again in 1848, the Wilmot Proviso was passed in the House, which was controlled by Northerners, and never passed through the Senate, which was even between slave states and free states. Now, the Wilmot Proviso said, no land that is acquired from Mexico as part of this war can be used for slavery. It was a way to block the Southern interests in this particular war. But since nothing is resolved about the status of the land, when the Mexican cession is bought, that means ceded from Mexico, for around $18 million, the U.S. gets California, New Mexico, and Utah territories, which are part of Colorado, part of Arizona, part of New Mexico, part of Utah. And they also officially get Texas, which technically was already part of the United States at the time, but now Mexico says, okay, fine, we admit that it's yours. So you've got all this land, and you've got the question of what is it going to be? Is it going to be free, or is it going to be slave? So what you see in 1848 is the emergence of a group called the Free Soil Party, because both the Democrats and the Whigs, neither one really wanted to touch this question, and the Free Soil Party said, we want this land to be free. Now, that was not a moral abolitionist argument, although there were some moral abolitionists as part of it. It was more of an economic argument that said, we don't want slaves in this land, because if there are slaves there, then we really don't have opportunities for poorer white people to work their way up. Now, the question of what's going to go on in this land really gets moved forward when gold is found in California in 1848, and people flood there, the 49ers, in 1849. By 1850, California wants to be admitted to the Union. And the question is, what do you do with California? Is it going to be a free state, or is it going to be a slave state? And so in 1850, there are plenty of tensions going on in the country. There's a convention in Nashville amongst fire eaters who say, we want to secede. If California is admitted, it's going to throw off the balance of free states to slave states. There are many people in the South who are quite upset about the northern efforts in the Underground Railroad. And so it came the question in Congress, what are we going to do? And so you have your classic Band-Aider, Henry Clay, who's on the scene. He's 73 years old. And he realizes that, yes, we need to find a compromise, not surprisingly. And he urges that the North and the South both make concessions to each other. And one of his main suggestions is we need a more stringent Fugitive Slave Act to help the South out. Now, John C. Calhoun, who is also Whig-ish, a nationalist, and he says, you know what, let's have Congress leave slavery alone, let's return runaway slaves. And then he has this crazy idea to elect one president from the North and one president from the South, each with veto power. Now, all of these are efforts to try to find a way to give both sides something, to keep this country together. But then you have Daniel Webster. In his famous 7th of March speech, many people thought that he was going to come out strongly against slavery in the territories, in the Mexican cession, because he was a Northeasterner. But he actually said, why legislate on slavery at all? Why should we even make a decision? Essentially, Mother Nature, through climate and topography and geography, has made it so that a plantation economy won't even work. In this 7th of March speech, many people called him a sellout in the Northeast because he seemed to sort of want to skirt the question altogether and not come down on the moral side. The one person who did come down on the moral side was a guy named William Higher Law Seward, who was so anti-slavery that he said Christian legislators must obey God's law and keep slavery out of the territories. In fact, the president at the time, Zachary Taylor, a Whig, and Whigs die in office, actually fell under the sway of Seward and was going to not compromise at all. Then he died, and Millard Fillmore came into office and was much more willing to compromise. So at the end of the day, there's going to be a compromise. The question is, who's going to get what out of all of this? So the North gets California as a free state. The New Mexico and Utah territories are open to popular sovereignty, namely the people in that territory will get to decide whether it's free or slave. But Mother Nature basically made it so that it wasn't conducive to slavery. So although it could have, in theory, gone to slavery, it wasn't going to. Now, the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is outlawed. It doesn't mean that slavery in D.C. is outlawed. It means the slave trade. So in some ways, it can be a win for both sides. The South, the big deal it got was the fugitive slave law was made stricter. So there was actually an old fugitive slave law in the Constitution, but in 1850, it was going to be much stronger. Fleeing slaves could not testify on their own behalf. They couldn't have a jury trial. Basically, a federal commissioner who was looking about whether this was in fact a fugitive slave would receive $5 if the runaway slave was freed and $10 if not. And anybody in the North who helped runaway slaves was subject to fines or jail sentences. So in the end, the South really only got the fugitive slave law, and the North got California as a free state and popular sovereignty in these areas, as well as no slave trade in D.C. But even though the South got this stronger fugitive slave law, many in the North really refused to even accept this new law. The Underground Railroad is going to increase its efforts. Massachusetts actually makes it a law that in its state that you couldn't enforce this fugitive slave law, so much like nullification that South Carolina we saw with the tariff. And other states, including Massachusetts, pass what are known as personal liberty laws, which say that you can't use our jails to house runaway slaves. So the fugitive slave law, the only part of the Compromise of 1850 that the South really got, is generally ignored and protested by the North. It does more than anything to really antagonize this relationship and show that a divorce is coming. An additional impact of the fugitive slave law is that Harriet Beecher Stowe, a woman who never lived in the South but lived near the South in southern Ohio, wrote about slavery in the South as a result of how upset she was about the fugitive slave law. And her goal was to inform the North about the wickedness of slavery, especially what happened with families that were split up by slavery. It's considered one of, if not the most influential American political novel, because what it did was it showed many in the North, what slavery was all about. Now, people in the South argued that this wasn't what slavery was all about, that it was in fact completely fabricated propaganda. But what it really had the impact of was not just getting support in the North, but getting support in France and Britain, where the book was very, very popular. And the impact of this was, if the French and the British governments ever came in on the side of the South in the Civil War, their citizens would be very, very upset. Now, this is important because the South always thought that it had cotton as its ace in the hole, that because Britain and France needed cotton, that if war ever came, they could count on their allies, Britain and France, to help them out. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin puts a real sort of thorn in that logic. Well, the South was really pissed off about Uncle Tom's Cabin and the North not respecting the fugitive slave law. they did see an advantage in potentially getting a railroad, transcontinental railroad, that would run from New Orleans south through Texas into the Mexican Cession, all the way to Southern California. The South, who was losing the economic race at the time to the North, was really desperate to get this route, yet the best route would actually go through northern Mexico, part of the land that the United States did not acquire from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So they actually made a purchase called the Gadsden Purchase, so that this route would actually not have to go through as many mountains and be able to get to California faster. Now, Stephen Douglas, who was the most powerful senator at the time from Illinois, was very concerned about this. He did not want the North to lose to the South in terms of getting this real economic boon. So he had to figure out, how am I going to get the South to give up this route so that the North can have it? What do I have to offer to them? And of course, he had the ability, at least in his mind, to offer them slavery above the 3630 Mason-Dixon line, which people in both the North and the South never thought would be changed. Now, Stephen Douglas had real estate in Chicago, and he wanted the railroad to start there and follow a northern route. But that would have to go through the unorganized Nebraska Territory. So Douglas's plan was to divide the Nebraska Territory into two different territories: Kansas, which would be in the southern part of the old Nebraska Territory, and then the Nebraska Territory. Now, Douglas promised that in these two territories there would be popular sovereignty, namely the people in Kansas could choose if they wanted slavery, and the people in Nebraska could choose if they wanted to have slavery. Now, in order to do this, you had to get the Missouri Compromise repealed. The Southerners never thought they would get any slavery above the Mason-Dixon line, and they were terribly excited. The Northerners saw the Missouri Compromise as sacred, but Stephen Douglas was able to ram this bill through Congress with his skill. What Douglas failed to consider was that the Northerners saw this 3630 Mason-Dixon line as sacrosanct, and so he saw it as just an opportunity in getting rid of it to get his railroad line. But at the end of the day, this was going to create as much problems as the Fugitive Slave Act in the North, and that it's going to really inflame their passions and make them work even harder against it. The impact of getting rid of the Missouri Compromise line was very strong in the North. Northerners continue to just not enforce the fugitive slave law. So they had not enforced it before, but now they sort of doubled their efforts to not enforce it. Anti-slavery as a movement gained many recruits. Southerners look at this and keep saying, this is unfair. First of all, Congress passed this law. It wasn't like we just forced it. It was passed by Congress. Plus, they keep going back and saying, the Compromise of 1850, we got the fugitive slave law. The North is not honoring it. Pity party continues. The North responds to the end of the Missouri Compromise by actually starting a new party, the Republican Party. Now, technically, I know that on your dates quiz, the Republican Party was formed before the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, but it actually was a response to the proposal of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So it actually is an effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, this Republican Party had a bunch of old Whigs, because remember, it goes Federalists, Whigs, Republicans. It has Free Soilers. It even has some Northern Democrats. This party, more than anything, is about limiting the expansion of slavery. While there are some abolitionists that are part of the party, this is not an abolition party, no matter what the South says.